Hayek. Friedrich Hayek was born in Vienna to a notable family. He was second cousin to Ludwig Wittgenstein. He served in the First World War, after which he took degrees in law and political science from the University of Vienna, while also studying philosophy, economics and psychology. His initial attraction to socialism was eradicated by his reading of Ludwig von Mises's Socialism. In 1973, Hayek wrote of the effect of Mises's socialism on him as follows. To none of us young men who read the book when it appeared, the world was ever the same again. Not that we all at once swallowed it, for that it was much too strong a medicine and too bitter a pill. But though we might try to resist, even strive hard to get the disquieting considerations out of our systems, we did not succeed. The logic of the argument was inexorable. Hayek attended Mises's Privatseminar along with many other subsequently distinguished students. With Mises's assistance, Hayek became the director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research before he joined the staff of the London School of Economics in 1931. His time in London brought him into contact with many important and influential people, including John Maynard Keynes. Hayek left London for Chicago in 1950 and later in the late 60s moved to Freiburg. After Freiburg, Salzburg, and then back for the last time to Freiburg. Although Hayek was initially best known for his work as an economist, his Nobel Prize was awarded for work done on the business cycle, his attention turned in the mid to late 1940s to social and epistemological matters. These were to be his principal concerns for the remainder of his life. In these fields he produced a series of works whose sheer size and concentrated reasoning inhibits effective condensation. Apart from his wartime The Road to Serfdom, Hayek produced The Constitution of Liberty, the 3-volume Law, Legislation and Liberty, and his final attack on socialism, The Fatal Conceit. The remarks that follow are largely confined to the first two of these works. Apart from his work in economics, certain aspects of Hayek's social and political thought are welcome and constructive contributions to libertarian theory. This would include his thorough investigation and elaboration of the notion of spontaneous order and his extensive work on law. Other aspects of his work are, as we shall see, not quite so welcome. Man's basic social life is ordered but is not designed or planned by anyone. It emerges from the interactions among individual human beings. Even if some modes of social interaction could have been designed, but weren't, other basic modes of social order cannot have been designed, for example, language. It follows from this that attempting to centrally plan a society is a bad idea, even if it were realizable, which it isn't. No one person, no one institution has all the requisite information to make the best decision. Computers won't help. It's not the speed of the calculation that is the problem, it's not having access to all the constantly shifting and changing data. Similar considerations apply to law. Hayek distinguished insightfully between law and legislation. Law is a systematically ambiguous term, and much confusion in discussion results from failure to disambiguate it. It can mean either those regulations that are made by those who consider themselves or are considered by others to be legislators, and that is law as legislation, or it can mean those rules that have emerged spontaneously in a community as a means of permitting the members of that community to live together in harmony, to resolve disputes, and, where possible, to prevent them arising. That's law proper. Both forms of law are meant to apply to all within the scope of a given jurisdiction, but whereas this is unproblematic for law proper, as such law emerges dynamically within the society to which it applies, it is not always unproblematic for law as legislation, which can be, and often is, selectively applied to some, but not to others in a society. Law proper is therefore coeval with society and must be antecedent to language, ethics, and the more idiosyncratic elements of culture. Without common rules, human beings could not live together in peace, and so society would be impossible. That being so, as Hayek notes, it would have to be the case that long before man had developed language to the point where it enabled him to issue general commands, an individual would be accepted as a member of a group only so long as he conformed to its rules. So far, so good. However, Hayek's views on politics, in particular on the related notions of liberty and coercion, will be less acceptable to libertarians. Problems here emerge as early as the 1944 work, The Road to Serfdom. For example, what exactly does Hayek mean in The Road to Serfdom when he says that there is nothing in the basic principles of liberalism to make it a stationary creed? If there are, as he says, no hard and fast rules fixed once and for all, just what is the essence of liberalism? According to him, we are to make use of the spontaneous forces of society, but only as much as possible. We are not to rule out coercion completely, but only use as little as possible. And the principle of laissez-faire is merely a rule of thumb, and a rough one at that. We get a better idea of what all this means a little later in the book, when he tells us that opposition to socialist central planning isn't to be taken as an endorsement of a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The forces of competition are the best way of coordinating human affairs because they make no use of coercion, but where it is impossible to create the conditions necessary to make competition effective, we must resort to other methods of coordinating individual efforts. But competition cannot be allowed free rein in all areas so that not all uses of coercion are disallowable. He writes, "To prohibit the use of certain poisonous substances or to require certain sanitary arrangements is fully compatible with the preservation of competition. Nor is the preservation of competition incompatible with an extensive system of social services, so long as the organization of these services is not designed in such a way as to make competition ineffective over wide fields." In all this, Hayek is taking an essentially Smithian line that there are some public goods that will be undersupplied by a free market among individuals, and which therefore can only be supplied by a state. He writes, "Thus, neither the provision of signposts on the roads, nor in most circumstances that of the roads themselves, can be paid for by every individual user. Nor can certain harmful effects of deforestation or of some methods of farming, or of the smoke and noise of factories, be confined to the owner of the property in question or to those who are willing to submit to the damage for an agreed compensation. In such instances, we must find some substitute for the regulation by the price mechanism." Not only are public goods to be supplied by the state, so also is a measure of social security. Hayek distinguishes between two kinds of security, limited and absolute. The former, such as a minimum of food, shelter and clothing, he thinks can be guaranteed in a wealthy society without endangering general freedom. Furthermore, he sees no reason why a state should not assist the individuals in providing for those common hazards of life against which, because of their uncertainty, few individuals can make adequate provision, so that the case for these states providing comprehensive social insurance is very strong. Even though Hayek concedes that democratic government might conceivably be as oppressive as the worst dictatorship, none of this is very encouraging for a libertarian. Some 15 or so years after The Road to Serfdom, in the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek defines freedom as the absence of coercion. We are concerned in this book with the condition of men in which coercion of some by others is reduced as much as is possible in society, so writes Hayek. This state we shall describe throughout as a state of liberty or freedom. What then is coercion for Hayek? Hayek's initial account links freedom to the idea of a person's not being subject to the arbitrary will of another, or others. Later, his account is that coercion occurs when one man's actions are made to serve another man's will, not for his own, but for the other's purpose. Apart from coercion, the most significant words in Hayek's account are "as much as is possible." Why is this? Well, because, it seems, coercion, however, cannot be altogether avoided, because the only way to prevent it is by the threat of coercion. Really? Free society has met this problem, he says, by conferring the monopoly of coercion on the state and by attempting to limit this power of the state to instances where it is required to prevent coercion by private persons. As the mapmakers say, here be dragons. So it appears then that for Hayek, coercion is a seemingly ineliminable fact of social and political life. We have a choice. We can have it everywhere in society, abounding and uncontrolled, or we can confine it to one particular institution and attempt to control its use there. But coercion is not equivalent to every form of influence by which one man may attempt to move another. Moreover, even in cases of genuine coercion, the will of the one coerced is free. If a mugger puts a gun to your head and says, "Give me your wallet, punk, or I'll blow your so-and-so head off," you can choose either to refuse and take your chances, or to give him your wallet. If you do give him your wallet, you are being coerced, but your will at the moment of decision is not being overridden. Aristotle made a similar point when he distinguished between voluntary actions and non-voluntary actions. A non-voluntary action is one which you perform, but which, under normal circumstances, you wouldn't, as for example, a ship's captain who jettisons his supercargo to save the ship and crew. Non-voluntary actions are, strictly speaking, voluntary, but the insertion of the non indicates that one's choice in this instance is based on one's estimate of the lesser of two or more evils. Why, Hayek asks, is coercion bad? Well, the answer, you might think, is because it is a violation of a person's freedom. However, that is not the answer that Hayek gives. His answer is oddly utilitarian. He writes, "Coercion is bad because it prevents a person from using his mental powers to the full and consequently from making the greatest contribution that he is capable of to the community." This latent consequentialism has, well, consequences, not the least of which is that it prevents Hayek from distinguishing successfully between the physical reality of force or violence and the moral, legal or political reality of coercion. The clearest instances of coercion occur where there is a threat of force or violence, but Hayek will not allow coercion to be confined to such manifest examples, remarking that the threat of physical force is not the only way in which coercion can be exercised. This refusal to confine coercion to the threat of physical force has immediate consequences, for when Hayek goes on to give a short list of examples of coercion, 3 of the 4 are physical while the 4th is not. He says, "True coercion occurs when armed bands of conquerors make the subject people toil for them, when organized gangsters extort a levy for protection, when the knower of an evil secret blackmails his victim, and, of course, when the state threatens to inflict punishment and to employ physical force to make us obey its commands." The conquerors, the gangsters, and the state all threaten physical violence. The blackmailer, in his capacity of blackmailer, does not. Hayek seems to see coercion as being a kind of continuum, ranging at one end from the most obvious and crude physical threats to, at the other end, unpleasant social behavior. What kind of actions could we locate at the lower end of the coercion scale? Well, Hayek has in mind, quote, "A morose husband, a nagging wife, or an hysterical mother may make life intolerable unless their every mood is obeyed." But this is nonsense. If these things are to count as coercion, then the concept has been inflated well past the point of usefulness. This continuum is only part of the larger one, where we have the threat of the initiation of physical violence at one end, and absolutely nothing like this at the other. As usual, in any continuum around the midpoint, we will have cases where it can be difficult to judge, but such difficulties do not prevent us from seeing clearly that the extremities are clearly coercive and non-coercive. Hayek seems to recognize this point himself when he says, quote, "Coercion can be so defined as to make it an all-pervasive and unavoidable phenomenon." While Murray Rothbard appreciates Hayek's definition of freedom in the Constitution of Liberty as the absence of coercion, he has significant problems with Hayek's extremely wide definition of coercion, which, while it subsumes the central aspect of coercion, namely the aggressive use of physical violence, also includes what Rothbard regards as peaceful and non-coercive actions as well. Hayek appears to regard all violence as being necessarily aggressive. In failing to distinguish between aggressive and defensive violence, Hayek's account is defective in yet another respect. Hayek's justification of the existence of the state, as well as its employment of taxation and other measures of aggressive violence, rests upon his untenable obliteration of the distinction between aggressive and defensive violence, and his lumping of all violent action into the single rubric of varying degrees of coercion, writes Rothbard. However problematic the inclusion of such actions as nagging under the rubric of coercion may be, even more problematic for critics such as Rothbard is Hayek's inclusion of certain refusals to exchange under the heading of coercion. The kind of thing Hayek has in mind is a situation where, given conditions of widespread unemployment, an employer might use the threat of dismissal to obtain concessions not originally contracted for. But whatever the ultimate moral status of such a threat, Rothbard is clear that dismissal is simply a refusal by the capital-owning employer to make any further exchanges with one or more people, and is, as such, an exercise of freedom. Another example of coercion given by Hayek that Rothbard finds unacceptable is that of the monopolist who refuses to sell a vital commodity to others in extremis, except on terms that they find harsh and unwelcome. Once again, Rothbard says that, assuming there is no antecedent wrongdoing by the monopolist, whatever the moral implications of his action, it cannot be considered coercion. Rothbard concludes, Hayek's middle-of-the-road failure to confine coercion strictly to violence pervasively flaws his entire system of political philosophy. And it's hard to disagree with that assessment. Coercion is either legitimate or it's not. If it's not, then it's not obvious why it becomes legitimate when monopolized by the state. Coercion isn't just physical force or the threat of such force, it's the wrongful use or threat of force. Physical force or violence is wrong if and when it is initiated by one man or one group of men against another. It is not wrong when it is employed to defend an innocent person against the initiation of force by another. Hayek concedes that the state employs coercion. It does so in respect of taxation and various compulsory services such as serving in the armed forces via conscription or doing jury duty. Is such coercion not a restriction of my freedom? Well, apparently not. The reason for this surprising answer is that the very predictability of such demands by the state somehow evacuates them of their harmful character. Now, lest I be accused of misrepresenting Hayek on this point, I am going to quote him here. He writes, "Though these are not supposed to be avoidable, they are at least predictable and are enforced irrespective of how the individual will otherwise employ his energies. This deprives them largely of the evil nature of coercion. If the known necessity of paying a certain amount of taxes becomes the basis of all my plans, if a period of military service is a foreseeable part of my career, then I can follow a general plan of life of my own making and am as independent of the will of another person as men have learned to be in society. Though compulsory military service, while it lasts, involves severe coercion, and though a lifelong conscript could not be said ever to be free, a predictable limited period of military service certainly restricts the possibility of shaping one's life less than would, for instance, a constant threat of arrest resorted to by an arbitrary power to ensure what it regards as good behaviour." All of this is Hayek. But this is nonsensical doublespeak. Yes, a broken leg is a less serious medical condition than pancreatic cancer, but it is still not a condition one would wish to have. Compulsory military service for a limited time is better than compulsory military service for life, but it is still a restriction and limitation of my freedom. Hayek's argument seems to amount to the fatuous claim that coercion by the state, because it is predictable and relatively impersonal, isn't really coercion, because after all, it might be worse. Rothbard has no difficulty exposing the absurdity of such a principle, pointing out that if everyone knew in advance that he would be tortured and enslaved 1 year out of every 3, neither would this be coercion. If earlier Hayek had indefensibly widened the notion of coercion to include non-aggressive actions, in other respects he narrows the notion of coercion to exclude clearly aggressive actions. In order to limit state coercion, Hayek asserts that coercion is either minimized or even does not exist if the violence-supported edicts are not personal and arbitrary, but are in the form of general universal rules knowable to all in advance. But such an account is scarcely plausible, given that it is easy to conjure up examples of patently unjustifiable actions and policies that could nonetheless be generally known in advance. Say, for example, a policy of culling 30% of female infants under the age of 2 every 4 years. In a memorandum to the Volcker Fund, which he wrote in 1958, Rothbard anticipates some of the points he will make years later in The Ethics of Liberty, but he is much more forthright and scathing in the memorandum than he is in the relevant sections of The Ethics of Liberty. Expressing surprise and distress, he describes the Constitution of Liberty as being an extremely bad, and I would even say evil book. Rothbard notes that while Hayek begins well by defining freedom as the absence of interpersonal coercion, when he comes to define coercion, the descent into the abyss begins. For instead of defining coercion as physical violence or the threat thereof, he defines it to mean specific acts of one person with the intent of harming another. If one were to open a grocery store next to Monopoly Incorporated, the only grocery store in the village, it is very likely that this would have a damaging economic effect on Monopoly's revenues, but it would not be a coercive act. However, suppose one bore a grudge against Monopoly Incorporated for the high prices they had charged one for graphic novels when a boy, and opened one store with the specific intention of causing harm to Monopoly, then it appears that the act would be coercive. Rothbard is rightfully puzzled at the strange outcome of the inflated conception of coercion. The problem then is this. Hayek's inclinations are that of a classical liberal. His moral inclinations, however, are utilitarian. Being unable to make use of a notion of natural law which would allow him to distinguish between the physical reality of violence and the moral reality of coercion, Hayek has no principled position from which to take a consistent stand for freedom. Part of the antipathy experienced by some to the idea of natural law arises from the mistaken notion that it necessarily has theological implications and is essentially a form of divine command ethical theory. Frank van Daan expressed the view that the term natural in natural law is to be taken literally, holding that natural law refers to the natural physical world of living human beings. Likewise, the law in natural law is not to be understood as a kind of superstatute, a kind of command or directive of some celestial or transcendental lawgiver. It is instead to be taken as referring to the order or bond of conviviality that has its natural foundation in the plurality and diversity of distinct and separate persons. Similarly, the renowned legal theorist Lon Fuller states clearly that these natural laws have nothing to do with any brooding omnipresence in the skies. They remain entirely terrestrial in origin and application. These natural laws are not residents of some empyrean region that descend on us from on high. They are not higher laws. If any metaphor of elevation is appropriate, they should be called lower laws. They are like the laws respected by a carpenter who wants the house he builds to remain standing and serve the purpose of those who live in it. This naturalistic conception of natural law must be taken seriously. If it is, then whatever other objections may be made to it, at least some of the more egregious ones will have been eliminated. Rothbard regards what he terms Hayek's inordinate passion for the rule of law and equality under the law as resulting from Hayek's brusque and cavalier dismissal of the whole theory of natural law as intellectually unsatisfying. Running together with this dismissive attitude to natural law and to natural rights is Hayek's continuous and all-pervasive attack on reason. Dismissing natural law or natural rights as a basis for political ethics, Hayek is left with only two options: either a blind adherence to custom and the traditions of the social organism, or the coercive force of government edict. The latter coercive option is identified with rationalism, and so the attack on coercion becomes an attack on reason. Hayek does not appear to realize that reason is in fact the very opposite of coercion, that force and persuasion are antitheses, and that this was so considered by the rationalist libertarians. Also, he doesn't seem to fully realize the paradox of using reason, as he tries to do, to attack reason. In the end, for Hayek, the freedom of an individual may be limited for all sorts of purposes that others, besides the particular agent, consider good. This is what permits Hayek to endorse a whole range of options that would be unacceptable to libertarians, including redistributive taxation policies, state support for and control of education, and so on. Because of his reputation and renown, Hayek tends to crowd out other more plumb-line defenders of liberty, just as we shall see Nozick do with libertarians. Hayek is a kind of classical liberal, someone who prioritizes freedom, but not in any absolute way. But you can't be a little bit unfree without compromising liberty. Practically, the restrictions Hayek endorses may be slight by the standards of current welfarism, but there is nothing intrinsically to prevent their extension, and that historically is what happened. Interestingly, Rothbard doesn't see Hayek as a liberal but as a neoconservative, inasmuch as he believes that we must blindly follow traditions even if we can't defend them. Rothbard sums up Hayek's overall position in the following way. Traditional social institutions are to be accepted on blind faith and without adequate reason. Reason cannot discover moral principles or justice. The argument for freedom rests on ignorance, and freedom means equality under the law, whatever the content of legal rules. Summary. Friedrich Hayek was born in Vienna to a notable family. Man's basic social life is ordered but is not designed or planned by anyone. It emerges from the interactions among individual human beings. Hayek distinguished insightfully between law and legislation. Hayek's views on politics, in particular on the related notions of liberty and coercion, will be less acceptable to libertarians. Public goods are to be supplied by the state, so also is a measure of social security. In the Constitution of Liberty, Hayek defines freedom as the absence of coercion. Coercion cannot be altogether avoided because the only way to prevent it is by threat of coercion. For Hayek, coercion is bad because it prevents a person from using his mental powers to the full and consequently from making the greatest contribution that he is capable of to the community. Hayek's refusal to confine coercion to the threat of physical force has immediate and deleterious consequences. Hayek seems to see coercion as being a kind of continuum, ranging at one end from the most obvious and crude physical threats to, at the other end, unpleasant social behavior. Hayek's justification of the existence of the state, as well as its employment of taxation and other measures of aggressive violence, rests upon his untenable obliteration of the distinction between aggressive and defensive violence, and his lumping of all violent action into the single rubric of varying degrees of coercion. But coercion is either legitimate or it's not. If it's not, then it is not obvious why it becomes legitimate when monopolized by the state. Hayek concedes that the state employs coercion. Is such coercion not a restriction of my freedom? Apparently not. The reason for this surprising answer is that the very predictability of such demands by the state somehow evacuates them of their harmful character. This is nonsensical doublespeak.